Hi everyone, my name is Matt and I'm one of the CAs for Sofia WUDC. Today I'll be talking about the updated rules governing knifing on page 40 and to whip speeches on page 41 of the latest edition of the WUDC Debating and Judging Manual. As the rule change to the knifing section is very small, most of this video will focus on whip speeches, but I'll start by outlining our changes to the knifing rules on page 40. As in previous editions of the manual, closing teams are bound to be consistent with their opening in most instances. If a closing team contradicts their opening, judges should ignore the argument that is inconsistent, in effect removing the advantage the team would have received as a result from consideration. There are only some rare exceptions where closing teams do not have to be consistent with their opening. These include 1. The opening team has conceded the debate or made an extremely damaging concession that makes the debate impossible to win from their side. B. OG has squirreled the motion, or OO has made an invalid counterprop. 3. The opening team has made a clearly false factual statement that the ordinary intelligent voter would recognize as false, e.g. in a debate about space travel, claiming that the moon is made out of cheese. We've added a single new instance where closing teams are not bound to be consistent with their opening, and that is as follows. If the opening team makes a concession that does not advance their own case, with the sole purpose of strategically narrowing their own closing team's available arguments, for example, making an unsubstantiated claim in 15 seconds that does not advance their case in any meaningful way and stating, if CG tries to say the opposite of this claim, it is a knife. To be clear, in this scenario, the only argument closing teams are not bound to be consistent with is the argument that the opening team conceded. They are still bound to be consistent with the rest of the team's case. This does not mean that knifing in all instances is allowed, nor does it mean that anytime your front half makes a concession, you don't have to be consistent with it. This rule is purely about concessions made in bad faith, i.e., if a team is making a concession with the sole purpose of restricting the amount of available arguments a closing team can make. For example, if a motion was, this house would pay gang members not to commit violent crimes, and OG runs a case, and then the last 15 seconds of their speech goes, by the way, we think gangs are really bad. They are horrible organizations. And if CG tries to run a case saying gangs are good, they can't because that's a knife. And the rest of their case had absolutely nothing to do with whether gangs are good or bad or not. That would be a concession made solely with the purpose of depriving CG of a valid extension. This does not mean you can't make concessions strategically. If you want to concede something to opposition in order to gain some kind of strategic advantage, that's perfectly allowed in opening, and closing teams are still bound to be consistent by that. Similarly, if you're baited into making a concession by a closing team's POI, like your OG, and you concede to something that closing asks you, that's still binding on your closing as well, because the concession was made in order to maybe avoid a more damaging concession, right? Or something like that effect, right? It's not made with the sole purpose of depriving your back half of available arguments. Only concessions that are made with the sole purpose of strategically depriving your back half from arguments are concessions that closing is not bound to be consistent to. Often this is really easy to assess as a judge. The team will just say straight up, if closing tries to do this, they're knifing. And other times, you as a judge can use your discretion to identify whether it's made in bad faith. It should be generally pretty obvious. Now on to whip speeches, which will be the more substantial portion of this video. When we made the decision to update this section, our main aim was to offer better clarity on precisely what kind of material is and is not permissible at whip, as well as to offer adjudicators clearer guidelines on how to assess whip speeches. So this is on page 41 of the manual, and we don't really view this as a change as much as it is a clarification. So at the top of this section, we've rewritten this to clarify that just like any other speech, whip speakers may introduce material to the debate, provided that material fulfills either of a two-part criteria we've set out in the section. The material can either be 1, responsive, and this includes all types of rebuttal, or 2, contributions which build on or deepen arguments already introduced by the member of government or the member of opposition. In essence, if the material directly addresses opposing claims, it's rebuttal, or if the material logically furthers the case as presented by member, it is permissible at whip. The only kind of material that whip speakers may not introduce is entirely new, non-responsive material that significantly alters the direction of their team's case. When evaluating non-responsive whip material to determine if it is permissible, judges should consider whether such material significantly changes the direction of the case for member in a manner that other teams reasonably could not have predicted. To be clear, you only apply this test if the material is not responsive. If the material is responsive, it doesn't have to pass the test because rebuttal is by definition allowed at whip. When judging whether a whip has significantly changed case direction, the test judges should apply is, would an ordinary team in the round have been able to reasonably predict this new argument or approach based on what the member speech said? If the WUDC material introduces a different line of argumentation that is completely distinct from member, the material receives no credit. As in previous editions of the manual, we've stressed that judges do not penalize the team beyond ignoring the content. The advantage of the team that would otherwise have been afforded by the rule violation is simply removed. There is no further penalty. To give an example of this, suppose a situation where the motion was, this House believes that developing countries should nationalize their natural resource industries, and CG's MG argues that nationalization allows states to directly fund public services and reduce inequality. It would be impermissible for GovWhip to get up and, unprompted, suddenly case shift by introducing a new argument that nationalization is key to resisting Western neo-imperialism and a principally justified response to the legacy of colonialism. The reason we introduced this test was because previous editions of the manual had some degree of ambiguity as to what quote-unquote new content was permitted at WUDC, and we saw some judges were overly punitive on quote-unquote new material. This standard preserves the spirit of the rule, i.e. WUDCs cannot change case direction dramatically at WUDC, while making it clear that just like any other speech, WUDCs can add material so long as it passes the test, that is, it is not significantly changing case direction from member. The manual also provides examples of contributions that are permissible, even if they are technically new, because they don't alter the direction of the case. These include new defenses of arguments previously made, new explanations or elaborations of previously introduced arguments, including new mechanisms, new examples of existing arguments, new explanations regarding the impact or prioritization of existing lines of argumentation, new characterization or framing, and new weighing. Each of these examples do not count as significantly changing the direction of the case as presented by member, and therefore judges should credit this material at WUDC. In other words, responsive material is always permitted at WUDC by definition. Non-responsive material, as long as it does not significantly change the direction of the case from member in a manner that other teams reasonably could not have predicted, is also allowed. We hope that those clarifications on changes to the knifing and WUDC's rules were helpful, and we're looking forward to seeing you in Sofia in just over a month. If you have any further questions about this section or any other changes in the new manual, please check out our FAQs posted on the Facebook page or contact a member of the Sofia World's Adjudication Corps. Thanks so much.